Okay, so today we're going to talk about the Create PT, or the Create Performance task for the AP CSP class. This is the performance task which is part of your exam. It's going to be graded as part of your AP grade, and it's basically a project. And you're going to do the project, you're going to program it, and then you're going to answer questions about it. Now, I got a lot of requests about this video in particular, even though you spent a lot of time in class answering the performance task and actually writing it, because a lot of people actually don't finish it in class, and a lot of people want to know about the free response question that they added in last year's AP. Even if you already did the Create PT, you might have already finished it. I'm going to give you some tips on some stuff you can do to prepare for the PT and to answer the free response questions you'll get during the exam. So what we're going to do are three things. First, I'm actually going to give you some general tips about the Create PT. That includes things on how to actually do the Create PT. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to just do a whole PT. I'm just going to do from start to finish a full Create PT task, doing what I would consider to be kind of the minimum requirements that would get the full points. So that should be pretty quick, actually, because we're not going to write a very complex project, as it turns out. And then what I'm going to do is in part 2 of this video, I'm going to do a follow-up video where I'm actually going to do the free response questions that are going to show up in the exam using the Create PT task project that I do in this video. And that should give you some ideas for how to actually approach that. When you're doing the Create PT, you're being given a whole lot of information. It can be pretty overwhelming. But what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to distill it down for you. So before the exam, when you actually are creating the PT at home, there's really only 3 basic parts to it. There's the code that you write, there's your video, which you make about your code, and there's what they call the personalized project reference, which is snippets of your code, little parts of your code that you take to the exam with you to answer questions during the exam. During the exam, all you have to do is answer 4 free response questions about the code based on that personalized project reference that you provided. That's basically all there is to it. Now that sounds like a lot, but if you look carefully at the code requirements, it turns out that there's not that much to it. There's only a few things you really need. One of the things you need is a list. And what that means is that you want to pick a project where it's pretty easy to use a list or to implement a list. For example, a list of your favorite movies. You want to pick a project where it's simple to use a list in a non-trivial manner, so basically in a way that's actually meaningful. The second requirement, it's this one right here. It says you need to have a function that has 1 or more parameters, and it has in it an algorithm that does the following things. It includes sequencing, selection, and iteration. Now sequencing we can ignore. We just focus on selection and iteration. Everything has sequencing. Selection means that it has a conditional, has an if statement. Iteration means it has a loop. So you have a function with a parameter, and it has a loop, and it has a conditional. That's all you need to do. With that, you actually are able to answer all of the questions. You do need to make sure, by the way, that it's a function you wrote. It's not a event handler, for example. And that's what I'm going to show you in the example that I'm going to do right after this. For the Create PT example, I'm going to make a full project. I'm going to be using code.org, which is in JavaScript, and this thing called AppLab. If you use a different curriculum, don't worry about it. The point of this isn't so much the project itself. I want to focus more on the code and the approach and kind of just showing you what types of things we do and we don't do, and really which parts of the code we're going to be focusing on to answer the questions. Okay, so let's get started with the project. I'm going to click here, a new project, and I'm going to go to AppLab to start a project, and it's going to be a very simple project. What this is going to be is a straightforward list of top whatever games, top 10, top 5 games. You're going to put in your favorite video games, and that's all this is going to do. It's going to have maybe one little thing like clearing the list. Other than that, it's going to be very straightforward, and that'll allow us to still do everything we need to do. So the first thing is I'm going to actually create the environment, which means I'm going to put the buttons and the inputs and stuff like that. It's the only time I'm going to do that. I'm not going to be doing any refinement. In fact, I don't recommend that you spend almost any time in this project doing any of that stuff. If you really want to, you can, but make sure you're done with the project first. So let's put an input here. This is where you're going to put in the text for your next favorite game. I'm going to put a button so that you can submit, and then I'm going to put this text area here. This is where the games are going to be listed. I'm going to put a button over here, and this button's going to be to clear the list. I'm going to put some labels. This one here is going to be just the title to tell the user what this whole thing is about. This will say top games or my top games, right? This is kind of sort of part of the requirement for the video part, in that it does tell you that it should be clear to the user kind of what the inputs are for the app, but you could probably get away with not even having these labels, but just for the sake of safety, let's put them. This one's going to say, type your next favorite game. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to this button, and we're going to rename the button here. We're going to make it say add. And we're actually going to do, we could leave all of the IDs the way they are, but we're actually going to change the IDs so that we can better identify them in the code. So I'm going to call this add button, like that. This input here is going to be called game input. And this button here is going to be called clear button. And this button is going to say clear. This right here is going to be called game list. And that's all we need to do for this part. From this we have all of the buttons and inputs that we need, and now we just have to start writing our code. And we're going to start doing that by clicking on the add button here, clicking events, and hitting insert and show code. And from this we're going to start writing our code to actually handle the input. And it'll automatically add this for us, and we're going to start with this. Now the requirements for this project, just as a reminder, we need lists and we need some functions that do some specific things. But the obvious thing to start with, let's get rid of this and let's add a list. Now our list is going to be holding our top games, so that's pretty obvious. So we'll start really straightforward. We're going to put a list up here. We're going to make it a global list. We're going to call it games, and we're going to make it an empty list to start out. So we start with an empty list. Now remember that you cannot use an event handler as one of your user-created or student-created lists. Instead, we have to create our own functions. Sorry, I said student-created list. I meant student-created function. We have to create our own function. So we go into functions, and we'll create one here called myFunction. We'll rename it something better. We'll call it add game to list. And we're going to give it one parameter, and the parameter will be the game that we're adding to the list. We're going to use a global list here, so we don't need to pass the global list as a parameter, but do make sure that you have a parameter. A global variable does not itself count as a parameter. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that when you click on this, on the button here, add button, it's going to first get whatever was in the input, and then it's going to try to add it to the list. So we'll start by getting that input. So we'll call it input over here. And we're going to get the input by going into UI controls and doing get text. And we'll get the text from the game input, which is this right here. And with that, we have the input, and now we have to actually add it to the list. So we'll do that by calling add to the list. We'll do add game to list, which is the function we define here. And we're going to pass it one parameter, or one argument, which is input. And with that, we will be calling our function at game to list with the input being whatever we typed in here. So basically, if I were to put in a game here, like Minecraft, and I hit add, it doesn't do it yet because we didn't do anything here yet, but this would set input to Minecraft, and it would call add to list with Minecraft. So let's go ahead and do that. What I want to do now is I want to add the game to the list. That's pretty straightforward. We can do append item. And we are going to append game. Make sure that you remove the quotes because it's the variable game, not the text game. We're going to add that to games. So we're appending game to games. If you're not sure how append item goes, you can hover over here and hit examples, and it'll explain. It'll tell you here that the first argument is list and the second one is item. All right, so that's going to add it to the list, but now we need to actually draw it over here. I'm going to make a small function here. Very simple function. It's going to be called update games. And all it's going to do is it's going to do the following. I'm going to create a variable here called the text, which is all the text that's going to go in here. And there's a couple ways of doing what I'm about to do. I'm actually going to do it in one of the simpler ways, which is I'm going to use join, which you may have learned about in a couple different ways in your class. What join is going to do is I'm going to take this list games, and I'm going to join it with this character right here, which is actually just a line. It's the end of the line. So what this is going to do is it's going to take each item from this list, and it's going to put a new line in between them. What that means is that this text right here is going to be just all the items in the list separated by lines. And each one's going to be in their own line. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the text of this right here, which is game list, to this text that I just created before. Make sure to take out the double quotes. And now I need to actually call update games. So after I add the item to the list, I am going to call update games, which is this function right here. And that's going to update this right here with whatever is in the list. So let's try that out. I'm going to try adding Minecraft here. And we see that it got added up here to the list. And let's add another game. Let's add Morrowind. Here we go. And you can see that our list here is the list of items that we're adding. Notice also that I can add the same game, and I can also add nothing, and it'll add that empty space. So we don't want that. So let's start by getting rid of that capability. In fact, let's start by doing something so that we can't add the same item to the list twice. We can do that by creating a function called existsInList. And what that function can do is that function can take the game and it can just check whether or not the game is in the list, and if it is, it can return true, and if it's not, it can return false. Now, here this is a very important point because this existsInList is a function that takes a parameter, and we can easily make this function fulfill all the requirements we need. Just this one little function. And we can do that by making it have iteration, selection, and a parameter. The iteration it's going to do is it's going to go through all the items in the list to see if there's already an item that's called game. And the selection is that it's going to check if each item is game. And with that, we actually are going to have a function that we can use to answer any question about this algorithm. What we'll do is we're going to implement existsInList, and we're going to use it in add game to list so that we only add the game to the list if this returns false, because it means there's no game in the list that has that name. So let's do a simple traversal. We're going to use a for loop. I'm going to use this one here. And this has for var I equals 0, for I is less than 4. We don't want 4 because our list can have any number of sizes, right? We don't know what the size is before we run the program, but what we can do is we can do for I is less than the length of the list. The list is called games, right? And then what we'll do is, for what this is doing is it's going through each item in the list, and for each item in the list, I'm going to check whether or not that item, whether game of I, so whether item I of that list, sorry, this is games of I, we're going to check whether or not it's equal to, oops, looks like I'm going to have to do this right here. I'm going to do the equals first. This is a lot easier if you type. So if games of I is exactly equal to game, then we're going to return true. So that means we found a game that has the same name as the one that we're trying to add. So that means that game already exists in the list. So if we found that game, we return true. Now, if we made it through the entire for loop, we iterated through all of the items in the list without finding it, at the very end, after the for loop is completed, we return false. It means we looked through all the items, we were not able to find that item, so we return false. Now let's actually use this inside of add game to list. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an if else here. And remember, what we were checking was if the item exists in the list, so if game, which is what we're trying to add to the list, it's this thing right here, if the game exists in the list, then we don't want to add it, which means that we're only going to be appending it in the else. And just for the sake of testing out our code, we can actually put a console log. This won't show up for the person using the program, but it will show up for the developer. And we can say something like, the game already exists, something like that. Again, whoever's using your program won't see this, but this is to help you actually write the program. So let's try this out. I'm going to type Minecraft here. I'm going to hit add, and that worked fine. And if I keep hitting add, you'll see that it's going to just keep logging this right here. Now I can say Minecraft 2, and it'll work just fine because that's not in the list. So what we see is if it's already in the list, we hit this right here, and if it's not in the list, then we actually add it to the list and update the list of games, which is just what we want. Now let's add one little thing. Let's add behavior for this clear button right here, because we want to make it easy to test our app, and it's kind of annoying if this list is always full here, right? So let's go ahead and go into design and hit clear and do insert and show code. And that's going to add this event handler right up here. Let's put it up here at the top next to the other one. And we're going to make it so that the clear button, if we click it, all it's going to do, it's going to be very simple. It's going to set games to an empty list. And it's going to call update game. Make sure to spell it correctly. Here we go. Oops. Now notice the warning. This warning correctly is showing us that games is already defined. I accidentally did var games instead of games. Make sure to always heed those warnings. So we don't want to create a new variable. I don't want to do this either. I want to do this one here. I want to set games equal to the empty list, and that should work fine. And what this will do is it's going to set the list to an empty list and then update it, so that what's going to end up happening is we're going to draw just nothing in the list. So if I put Minecraft here, put Minecraft 2, hitting clear is going to clear out that list so I can go back to adding my games. Now I'm going to do one last thing here. I'm going to add an extra conditional here. And not only am I going to check for whether the game exists, I'm also going to check to make sure that the game is not empty. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to say if game is nothing, I'm also going to avoid adding it to the list. So I'm going to console log the input is empty. And we don't want to let the user add empty items to our list. So let's go ahead and test that out. I'm going to put nothing in there, and I'm going to hit add, and notice that it's saying the input is empty. But if I put something else in, it'll work just fine. And notice how we can use this to help us make sure that the code is working as intended. All right, and then I can go ahead and clear this and create my own actual list. Baldur's Gate, put Morrowind, Fallout 2, and there we go. We have my top 3 right there. All right, and guess what? This is the whole program. This is everything we need. It's a very short program. Turns out this is all we need for a full Create PT project. With this, we actually have the parts that we need in order to answer the questions. We have a list right here. We have this function right here, exists in list, which can fulfill the algorithm with a function that takes a parameter and has iteration right here with a for loop and has selection right here with this conditional. And that'll allow us to actually answer any questions that require that. Notice also it is a student developed procedure because this function is something we developed, as opposed to, for example, these on events, which it clearly indicates are not student developed procedures. Now for the sake of completion, let's see how this will fit into the personalized project reference. For part I, it requires the first program code segment must be a student developed procedure that defines procedure's name and return type. Doesn't need to define the return type since it's JavaScript here. It contains and uses one or more parameters. It implements an algorithm that includes sequencing, selection, and iteration. All of those are done over here by exists in list. So we have the parameter, we have the iteration, and we have the selection. So we can use this for part I. For part II, or part 2, it wants us to show where in the code we are calling this procedure, and that is this right here. So we can put add game to list into that part of the personalized project reference. Now the way you can do this, you could just take a screenshot of this, or you could actually just do show text right here. That's probably what I would prefer, and just kind of separate it out and just copy that text and just put it into the box. So I'll put add game to list for 2, and for 1 I will put this one right here, exists in list. All right, now for parts 1 and 2 of the list section, it says the first one, it wants a program code segment must show how data have been stored in the list. And for that, you can use this part right here. We can show add game to list, which has append item, which is where we add the items to the list. Now for the second one, we actually have some options. We can put this right here. We can say exists in list. This does use the list for its intended purpose. We could also use it in update games right here, right? We join the list here by new lines in order to populate the actual visual output of the list. So we could actually put that here. And both of these will fulfill that segment, and we can use that to answer questions. One last little detail, by the way, in all of this. When you do the video, make sure that you are showing not just some random part of your game or project or whatever you put in, but how it's using inputs and outputs. So use, in this example, the text box to add something to your list, which will show the item appearing as an output. That's very important, right? Now that actually concludes this video, and which is part 1. In part 2, I'm going to actually go through and use this code and these code samples I've presented here to answer the free response questions that they're going to ask in the exam.